our first speaker on to begin with today's program. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Henry Kwesi Prempeh. And Professor Henry Kwesi Prempeh will be speaking to us on the subject of our political parties and our democracy. Are they helping or hurting our democracy? The political parties and our democracy, are they helping or hurting our democracy? Professor Henry Kwesi Prempeh is a professor of law. He's been at Seton Hall University Law School, Newark, New Jersey, in the USA, where he taught courses in constitutional law, comparative constitutional design, and corporate law. Among others, Professor Prempeh has been all over, if you like, particularly Africa, helping nations, countries to design constitutions that are responsive to the people. He is the executive director of the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, please, let's have your statement. Please unmute your mic.
Good morning. Good morning, Samson.
Good morning.
Thank you for deeming me worthy of a slot on this program about change statements. I have chosen to speak today on the question of our political parties. And I don't frame it as our political parties and democracy. Actually, I frame it as our political parties versus our democracy. But it is not exactly clear to me at this point, given the evidence that is before us, and that has been before us in the last 30 years of this new democratic project. It's not exactly clear to me that we have come to see parties as performing the kind of role that we envisioned for them. When 30 years ago, we went to a referendum and voted ourselves a new constitution, which new constitution cleared the way for the unbanning of political parties in readiness for the 1992 general elections. Subsequent to those elections, a newly elected government assumed office January 7, 1993, and brought with it multi-party democracy. Now, we've been a party people for quite some time. It goes way back into our history. Political parties first emerged in Ghana during the Gold Coast years, and not as we usually assume in the post-Second World War period. They actually started much earlier in municipal elections. So when the colonial government opened the door in some selected urban centers or cities and towns to elections to seats on town councils, parties began to emerge. Ratepayers Association, Mambi, and all of those groups. But at the national level, of course, we date the formation of political parties in Ghana to the event culminating in the breakaway of the Convention's People Party, CPP, from the United Gold Coast Convention. At the time, of course, again, the trigger for this was impending elections. We were, for the first time, going to have open elections into a legislative assembly. And that was the impetus for parties to form. So party formation has something to do with the right, having a right to elect representatives into a legislative assembly or into political office. Now, we've had quite a bit of seesaw with parties. So after independence, the the dominant the dominant elite view represented by the Nkrumah and the CPP, were that multi-parties were divisive. We were a country in a hurry. We couldn't afford the kind of division that we thought the argument then was that parties brought with them. And also that we needed to harness all of our limited resources, human and others, to execute the project of development, which was really the most pressing issue at the time. So the idea, which was not only in Ghana, but it was actually a conventional kind of wisdom at the time, was that we should do away with multi-parties and have just one party. That one party is supposedly going to represent all of us. So we had one-party states. And of course, we also moved on with coups d'etat. We then had no-party governments. Military regimes are essentially no-party governments. Parties are abolished during that period. And so we've tried one-party state, we've tried no-party government. And in fact, at one point, one of those regimes attempted an innovative idea. I mean, in terms of, as far as Ghanaian political science goes, I guess that's probably the most innovative idea that has come from the country, which is a union government, a no-party civilian military police kind of government. All of us, basically working together. It's a referendum was held. The outcome of which was somewhat dubious. The project failed. So we've tried. We rejected union government, and now, of course, each time we have restored democracy, we have done it on the basis of multiple parties, because we think that parties represent something good. And in fact, in the 1992 Constitution, parties are the only private associations for which the Constitution actually makes substantial provision for how it must be shaped and formed and the like, right? Some internal rules and the like. So when you look at Article 55 on the chapter of the representation of people, a whole 17 clauses are devoted to political parties. No other private association of people in the country gets that kind of mention in the Constitution, which tells us that we think parties are special. They are not just private entities as such, they are special. And the character of the party is important to the character, is an important determinant of the character of the democracy that we're going to have. So we try to make a few rules about how those parties must behave or how they must look like. And then when you go to the provision on the Constitution in Chapter 6 on directive principles of state policy, parties are also explicitly mentioned as among those institutions, non-states albeit, that must be guided in their behavior and others by those directive principles of state policy. So Article 34.1 names parties along with the president, cabinets, and all of that as among those bodies to think about the directive principles of state policy in their conduct. So 30 years after the fact, after this democratic project, I think it's a long enough time to do some appraisal of where we think we are with our parties. Are they a force for good in our democracy? Are they behaving as we would expect them to do in our democracy? Are they helping us sustain our democracy? And of course, one could argue that, with parties, we have been able so far to have orderly transitions of power from one regime to the other, over some successive period. So you could say that parties have contributed to that kind of orderly transition of power through the ballot box. And that's fine. But I think increasingly, parties are also beginning to leave a sour taste in the mouth of many Ghanaians. And why do I say that? So there are a few pieces of evidence to support that proposition. We have recently tried, there's been quite a clamor for the democratization of local government through the election of metropolitan, municipal, and district chief executives. That whole project has stalled because a strong majority of Ghanaians are opposed to the entry of political parties into our local government space. So, survey after survey, by CDD, by NCC, by IBEC, show that Ghanaians do not want political parties. And when you ask them, the debates that we had, including, on social media around the referendum that was called off in December 2019 about parties, even civil society organizations, pro-democracy civil society organizations were strongly opposed to the involvement of parties. Ghanaians have also not been warm to the idea of public funding for parties. Whenever it has been thrown out, there's huge opposition to the idea. And then you see that a substantial number of Ghanaian voters are so, frustrated with the absence of checks and balances between our parliament and the executive branch, that they think that the solution to that is to divide those branches between two parties. So all of these are evidences that somewhat our parties have not impressed us, and that we would really are having a rethink. I don't even know if today, if you had the union government referendum today, how it would look like, whether Ghanaians would actually go for a no-party state. And in fact, a strong, an emerging constituency of youth voters, young people, are beginning to entertain ideas of, democracy, but without parties, not just here, in many other places. So I think this is causing me, as a Democrat, to really, ask ourselves, it's causing me some, apprehension, and I'm worried about what it is that we're getting from our party. So for me, this idea of political parties, it's not as though we are rejecting parties per se. And in fact, we did recently some focus group discussions across the country on this idea of why to really tease out why people don't want political parties, for example, in local government elections. And when you push the idea, when you push them, present different scenarios and options, what you get is a sense that it is not political parties per se. It is certain behaviors, certain tendencies that our parties have exhibited and have shown themselves to exhibit. That is actually putting people off. And what are those behaviors? So tension during elections. Each time we have general elections coming up, we approach it with a lot of apprehension and anxiety. Why? Because it has become almost the equivalent of war, especially for our two main rival parties. Election violence and political party vigilantism, a term that we didn't, have, in our democratic nomenclature, but for parties. A lot of, apprehension about election violence and vigilantism. And even in internal party primaries, we have begun to see, incidents and high risk of some such violence. Our parties and partisans have exploited and exacerbated pre-existing conflicts across the country, chieftaincy disputes and others. Every little thing is now given, every little conflict sooner than later takes on a party flavor. This is beginning to heighten polarization in our society. In between elections, what are we seeing with our parties? We may not have a de jure one-party state, and we don't, but we do have a party state now. And the party states, our party states operates essentially as a one-party state just in 4-year increments. The party that wins power, and I'm talking not just about winner takes all, but there's a certain party-first ideology and agenda that has replaced the national and public interest as the guiding principle in governance. In the 1960s, the slogan was the CPP is Ghana and Ghana is the CPP. Today, when the NPP is in power, the NPP is Ghana, and Ghana is the NPP. And when their rivals take over, Ghana becomes the NDC, and the NDC becomes Ghana. The party card has become more valuable than the Ghana card. Just look at the sheer amount of investment in advertising and other carrots and sticks we had to throw in for the average Ghanaian to go and queue for a Ghana card. The party card, for the party card, you don't need advertisement at all. In fact, they won't even, they will hide it from you. It's a very scarce commodity. The demand far outstrips the supply, and the supply is kept actually intentionally low by the party executives, because really our parties are not that interested in members. They just want voters. They just want you to vote for them. Members, the fewer the merrier. So there's a number of developments that we're seeing. Protocol, based on partisan criteria, has now come to replace meritocratic and open recruitment into our public services and state enterprises. And what we are talking here is how scarce livelihood opportunities in a very low job creation economy are distributed. And they are distributed now, basically according to partisan criteria. So you see that the party and the state has become basically synonymous, and there's this clear state capture by our parties. And there are no sacred cows in this. All public institutions are up for grabs. Universities, everywhere, even in student unions, because the capture is proceeding apace. It has made fighting corruption and even sometimes just ordinary criminality difficult, very difficult, if not impossible, because once it emerges that a party person is involved, and it doesn't even have to be some big oligarch or kingpin, sometimes just the local, it becomes difficult to actually proceed with the appropriate criminal liability or punishment. So impunity is running amok because parties and partisans are making it difficult to enforce the law. They become tin gods above the law. Parliament is supposed to be an oversight body, but Parliament is not a uniparty organization. And to the extent that there are rivals parties there, they have failed basically in their work as a check on the executive, because the party of the executive basically almost always predictably goes along with the executive's agenda. We see a lot of party militias and foot soldiers engaging in thuggery. Difference between campaigning and governance has all but disappeared. We have almost like a permanent campaign even when elections are over. The next 4 years is not just for governing. Every time is for campaigning as well. Okay. So when you put all of this together, it appears to a lot of Ghanaians that now when we vote, what do we vote for practically? We vote practically essentially for which group of partisans and their kin and associates to make rich, to put above the law, to make untouchable in our society. This is definitely not what we signed up for when we signed up for democracy with parties in April 1992. Instead of democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people, today the people matter largely as subjects and as voters once every 4 years. In the period in between and after elections, democracy has become in large measure government by the party and partisans for the party and partisans. And I worry because we're seeing globally, including in our region, a certain recession, democratic recession. We have been spared some of the events that have happened elsewhere, democratic collapse in other societies. But collapse is not, we shouldn't collapse before we know, before we get worried. The degradation of the quality of our democracy is, for me, what matters. Excellent. And we still have time and an opportunity, right, to make, to change course.
All right.
to make the appropriate correction and to change course.
All right.
And I think also, one of the reasons that this has to matter to us is that while we may not admit it, and we hate oftentimes to admit the truth, our parties too, our two main rival parties especially, despite appearances to the contrary, are in significant respects rival ethno-regional coalitions. Thereby, so it exacerbates the implications of some of these behaviors. So that, for example, if you distribute scarce public resources like jobs and the like, according to partisan criteria, what you're also doing is giving a certain ethno-regional coloration to the distribution of opportunities in our society. All of these things, when you put that together, we are really, I think our parties are behaving in a way that is giving democracy a bad name, taking democracy for granted. They are some of the biggest beneficiaries of our democracy since 1993, and yet, in my view, are not behaving in ways that ensure the long-term sustainability of this democratic project.
Okay. Thank you so very much, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh.